For nearly 6 centuries, a small nation on the western edge of Europe would rule lands spanning 4 continents. From the lush jungles of Brazil to the bustling spice ports of India, from the rugged coasts of West Africa to distant enclaves in China, the Portuguese Empire became the first truly global empire in human history. But how did a country with fewer than 2 million people at the time rise to dominate the seas and establish colonies thousands of miles apart? And how did that empire rise, prosper, and eventually fade into history? It's a story that begins in the 12th century with the birth of Portugal as a kingdom and unfolds through the medieval crusades, the great voyages of discovery, the fierce age of European imperial rivalry, and finally, the post-colonial revolutions of the 20th century. Along this journey, we will uncover the motives that drove Portugal's expansion, the hunger for trade, the zeal of religion, the struggle for survival, and the pursuit of wealth. We will meet the kings, explorers, merchants, missionaries, and rebels who shaped its destiny. And we will examine not only the power Portugal once wielded, but the resistance it faced and the legacies it left behind. This is not simply a tale of conquest and gold. It is the story of choices made across centuries of discovery, of an empire that helped shape the modern world long before it vanished from it. Let us begin. The story of the Portuguese Empire does not begin with ships at sea or exotic spices from Asia. It begins on land, with a fight for freedom. In the early 12th century, what would become Portugal was merely a borderland on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, caught between mighty Christian kingdoms and the long conflict with Muslim-ruled territories. In 1139, a young nobleman named Afonso Henriques rose against his own mother's forces and declared himself king after victory in battle. At the time, he was only Count of Portugal, a vassal under the Kingdom of Leon. But Afonso desired more than a title. He wanted sovereignty. He led a series of bold campaigns against both Muslim forces in the south and Christian rivals in the north. His most celebrated victory came at the Battle of Urique in 1139, where he claimed divine favor for his rule. Soon after, he proclaimed himself King of Portugal and began seeking recognition from both the Pope and neighboring realms. It took decades, but by 1179, the Kingdom of Leon formally acknowledged Portugal's independence. That same year, Pope Alexander III issued a papal bull confirming Portugal as a sovereign Christian kingdom. This moment marked the official birth of Portugal as a nation-state, the first in Europe to establish nearly its modern borders so early in its history. Geography would prove crucial to Portugal's destiny. Hemmed in by Spain to the east and the vast Atlantic Ocean to the west, Portugal's land frontier was small, limiting opportunities for inland expansion. But the sea offered boundless possibilities. An open frontier with fewer rivals in a Europe where maritime trade was only beginning to flourish. Over the next centuries, Portugal would look increasingly toward the Atlantic, cultivating a seafaring identity that would define its empire. During the 13th century, Portuguese kings focused on pushing southward in the Reconquista, the Christian campaign to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. Under King Sancho II and King Afonso III, Portuguese armies advanced as far as the Algarve, completing the reconquest of modern Portugal by 1249. That same year, a treaty with Castile confirmed Portugal's borders, which have remained largely unchanged to this day. With the south secured, attention turned inward. In the 14th century, King Dinis, known as the Farmer King, expanded agriculture, reorganized royal lands, and promoted education. Yet one of his most lasting contributions was the creation of the Portuguese Navy in the early 1400s, laying the foundation for the maritime ventures to come. Portugal's society remained mostly rural and feudal. The nobility owned vast estates, the church held immense influence, but towns were growing. Lisbon, Porto, and Coimbra began to rise as centers of commerce and governance. Merchants, craftsmen, and sailors gained prominence. the very people who would later drive overseas expansion. Beyond its borders, Europe was changing too. In the Mediterranean, Venice and Genoa dominated sea trade, while Muslim powers controlled North Africa and the land routes to Asia. Northern Europe was prospering, and competition for trade routes intensified. Portugal, perched at the far edge of Europe, began to imagine new ways to reach the riches of the East, not over land, but by sea. The Portuguese kingdom was deeply Catholic. The crusading fervor of the Reconquista blended with royal policy and national identity. Expansion would later be seen as both commercial enterprise and divine mission. Even in these early days, those ideas were taking root. But the 14th century also brought crisis. The Black Death struck Portugal in 1348, killing perhaps a third of its people. Farms lay abandoned, labor shortages weakened feudal power, and social unrest grew. Then came political turmoil. When King Fernando died without a male heir in 1383, a succession crisis erupted. Out of this chaos rose the Avis dynasty. João of Avis, a military commander, led a nationalist uprising against Castilian claims to the throne. His victory at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385 was not just a military triumph. It was a defining moment for Portuguese independence. João became King João the Fern, founding a new royal line that would guide Portugal into its imperial age. This victory had far-reaching consequences. It united the nobility under the new dynasty and reinforced a strong sense of identity separate from Castile. King João the Fern strengthened ties with England through the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, one of the oldest alliances still in effect today. This Anglo-Portuguese alliance would shape the nation's politics and overseas ventures for centuries. It was during João the Fern's reign that the seeds of expansion were sown. He and his English queen, Philippa of Lancaster, had several sons who became known as the illustrious generation, men destined to lead Portugal's age of exploration. Among them was Prince Henry, later called the Navigator. But even before his voyages, the victory at Aljubarrota and the stability of the Avis dynasty had created the fertile ground for ambition. By the end of the 14th century, Portugal was still small, but it was united, stable, and increasingly turned toward the Atlantic. The sea, once a boundary, had become a gateway. At the dawn of the 15th century, Portugal stood ready, a cohesive kingdom with fixed borders, a naval tradition, and a dynasty looking beyond Iberia. King João the Fern's reign brought unity, and his son Prince Henry would bring vision. Born in 1394, Henry was the third son of the King and Queen Philippa of Lancaster. Not destined for the throne, he was given military and administrative duties, but his passion for geography, navigation, and discovery would define his life. In 1415, Portugal embarked on its first overseas conquest, the capture of Ceuta, a North African city across from Gibraltar. Ceuta had long been a vital trading hub between Africa and the Mediterranean, a center of commerce in gold, ivory, spices, and enslaved people. For Portugal, it promised both religious glory and material wealth. Prince Henry helped organize the campaign, and though Ceuta's long-term value proved limited, it did not grant access to the deep Saharan trade. Its capture marked a historic turning point. Portugal had projected its power beyond Europe. Ceuta became the first foothold in a maritime empire. Afterward, Prince Henry established himself in Sagres in southern Portugal. While the famous School of Sagres may not have been a formal institution, Henry indeed gathered skilled navigators, mapmakers, shipwrights, and astronomers to advance maritime knowledge. During this period, Portuguese shipbuilders refined the caravel, a small, agile vessel capable of sailing against the wind and enduring long ocean voyages. With improved maps and navigational tools such as the astrolabe and compass, Portuguese mariners began venturing farther down the West African coast than any Europeans before them. Henry's ambition was twofold: to reach the sources of African gold and to find Christian allies. perhaps even the legendary Prester John, to join a renewed crusade against Islam. From the 1420s onward, Portuguese ships explored the West African coast step by step. Early voyages were cautious, haunted by superstition and fear of the unknown. But in 1434, navigator Gil Ernest successfully rounded Cape Bojador, once believed impassable, proving the seas beyond were safe. This achievement shattered old myths and opened the way for further exploration. By the 1440s, Portuguese ships had reached the Senegal and Gambia rivers, and by 1444 the Cape Verde region. Under Prince Henry's sponsorship, they mapped new coastlines, established trade links, and began acquiring gold and enslaved people. From the very beginning, exploration and exploitation were intertwined. The Portuguese were not just charting geography, they were building commerce, including the early Atlantic slave trade. In the 1440s, enslaved Africans were captured or purchased and transported to Lisbon, where in 1444 the first public slave auction took place. This marked the start of a transatlantic system of human bondage that would expand immensely in the centuries to come. Prince Henry himself profited from these ventures. Though often romanticized as a visionary navigator, his motives were complex, part religious zeal, part political ambition, part personal gain. But what remains undeniable is that under his guidance, Portugal became the first European state to systematically explore and exploit the Atlantic world and the African coast. Meanwhile, the Portuguese began colonizing the Atlantic islands. Madeira was discovered around 1419 and settled soon after. The Azores followed in the 1430s. These island colonies served as laboratories for empire, testing grounds for navigation, settlement, and agriculture, the stepping stones to a global age that was only just beginning. He realized that to dominate trade, Portugal needed to control the narrow straits and ports through which the wealth of Asia flowed. In 1511, he led a daring campaign eastward to capture Malacca, the vital trading hub that connected the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Malacca was one of the richest ports in Asia, a cosmopolitan city filled with merchants from China, Arabia, India, and the Malay world. Albuquerque's forces stormed the city after fierce resistance, seizing vast treasures and establishing Portuguese authority over the region. With Malacca under Portuguese control, they now held the key to the spice trade routes leading to the Indonesian archipelago. From there, Portuguese expeditions soon reached the Moluccas, known as the Spice Islands, the very heart of the clove and nutmeg trade. By controlling Malacca and Goa, Albuquerque had effectively placed Portugal at the crossroads of the world's most valuable commerce. His next ambition was even grander: to control the entrance to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, the two main arteries of trade connecting the Indian Ocean to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. In 1513, he launched an expedition into the Arabian Peninsula and captured the city of Hormuz, a critical port at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. From Hormuz to Malacca, a vast network of Portuguese strongholds and alliances now stretched across the Indian Ocean. Each post was fortified, each governed by captains loyal to the crown, and each connected by fleets that patrolled the waters to enforce Portuguese dominance. Albuquerque's system was as much about power as it was about profit. Portuguese ships demanded passes known as cartazes from all merchant vessels sailing in the Indian Ocean. Any ship without one risked being seized or destroyed. This policy allowed Portugal to control trade and extract taxes from other powers, effectively turning the ocean into a managed empire. But this system also created deep resentment. Local rulers, Arab traders, and other Asian powers viewed the Portuguese as violent intruders who sought to impose their will through force and coercion. The once peaceful sea lanes of Asia were now scenes of conflict and confrontation. Albuquerque's rule, though effective in expanding Portugal's reach, was marked by brutality. He believed terror and military strength were necessary to maintain order, and his campaigns often left destruction in their wake, yet his strategic vision endured. By the time of his death in 1515, Portugal had established the foundations of an Eastern Empire, a chain of fortified outposts stretching from East Africa to the Spice Islands. Lisbon had become the capital of a global trading network that connected continents. Gold, ivory, and slaves flowed from Africa. Spices and silks came from Asia. And silver from the Americas would soon join the circuit. Portugal's navy ruled the seas, and its influence extended farther than any empire before it. In the decades that followed, this system continued to expand. Portuguese captains explored new waters, sailing beyond India to Ceylon, Burma, Siam, and China. By the 1550s, Portuguese merchants had reached Japan, establishing trade in silver, porcelain, and firearms. From Lisbon to Nagasaki, an unbroken chain of maritime connections linked east and west. But while this global network brought immense wealth to Portugal, it also stretched the small kingdom's resources to the limit. Maintaining distant garrisons, fleets, and governors required constant manpower and funding. Corruption and inefficiency plagued the administration of the Estado da India. Local Portuguese captains often acted independently, trading for personal profit and ignoring royal orders. Meanwhile, rival European powers began to challenge Portuguese supremacy. The Spanish, following Columbus's voyages, had established their own empire across the Atlantic. The Dutch and English would soon enter the Indian Ocean, eager to break Portugal's monopoly. In Asia itself, Muslim and local powers adapted and resisted. The sultanates of the Indian Ocean began to unite against the Portuguese presence. Ottoman fleets sailing from the Red Sea clashed with Portuguese squadrons off the coast of Arabia and India. Despite these growing threats, for nearly a century, Portugal remained the dominant maritime empire. Its ships carried pepper and cinnamon from India, nutmeg and cloves from the Moluccas, and gold and slaves from Africa to Europe. Lisbon became one of the richest cities in the world, a glittering hub of global commerce where merchants from every corner of the earth gathered. But beneath this prosperity, the empire's foundations were beginning to weaken. The wealth that flowed into Portugal enriched a small elite, but did little to strengthen the kingdom's institutions. Portugal's population was too small to sustain a vast empire. Its navy, though powerful, was constantly overextended, and the very success of its maritime system invited rivals to imitate and surpass it. By the early 17th century, the Dutch and the English had established their own East India companies, backed by private capital and advanced naval technology. One by one, they began seizing Portuguese ports and monopolizing the spice trade. In 1641, the Dutch captured Malacca. In 1650, they took Hormuz. And by the 1660s, the Portuguese presence in much of the Indian Ocean had been reduced to a few isolated enclaves like Goa and Macau. Yet even as their Eastern Empire declined, Portugal found renewed strength in the west, in Brazil. Discovered accidentally by Cabral in 1500, Brazil became the jewel of Portugal's overseas possessions. Its vast lands, fertile soil, and abundance of resources offered a new foundation for the empire's wealth. Sugar plantations expanded rapidly along the Brazilian coast, worked by enslaved Africans brought through the Atlantic slave trade that Portugal had helped pioneer. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the discovery of gold and diamonds in Brazil brought another wave of prosperity, making Lisbon once again one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. But this wealth came at a heavy price: exploitation, slavery, and the destruction of indigenous cultures. By the dawn of the 19th century, global tides were shifting once more. Napoleon's invasion of Portugal in 1807 forced the royal family to flee to Brazil, making Rio de Janeiro the capital of the Portuguese Empire for over a decade. When the monarchy eventually returned to Europe, Brazil declared its independence in 1822, peacefully ending over 3 centuries of colonial rule. What remained of the Portuguese Empire entered its final phase, centered mostly in Africa and Asia. In Angola, Mozambique, Goa, and Macau, Portugal held on to fragments of its once vast dominion. But by the 20th century, the age of empires was drawing to a close. Independence movements rose across Africa and Asia, and Portugal's remaining colonies gradually broke free. The last Macau was handed back to China in 1999, closing a chapter that had begun over 600 years earlier. From a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, Portugal had once built the first truly global empire, an empire of ships, spices, and ambition. Its legacy is complex, marked by exploration and innovation, but also by conquest and suffering. It reshaped the world's trade, connected continents, and forever changed the course of human history. And though the empire itself has vanished, its echoes still linger in the languages, cultures, and histories of the many places it once touched. This is the story of Portugal, the small nation that sailed beyond its shores, and in doing so helped define the modern world. In the year 1511, Albuquerque captured Malacca, a vital port on the Malay Peninsula that commanded the gateway to the Spice Islands and the South China Sea. With Malacca under Portuguese control, the empire gained access to the very heart of Southeast Asian trade, creating a launch point for ventures toward the fabled Moluccas, the Spice Islands of modern-day Indonesia. Albuquerque's ambitions extended beyond Southeast Asia. He sought control over the entrances to both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. In 1512, he attempted to seize the island of Hormuz, which guarded the Persian Gulf. Though his first attempt failed, he returned in 1515 and captured it successfully, securing a strategic position that allowed Portugal to monitor and disrupt trade between Persia and India. His dream of dominating the Red Sea and reaching the Holy Land, however, would remain unfulfilled. Still, his strategic vision reshaped history. The Estado da India, Portugal's overseas administration, was unlike later colonial empires. It did not involve vast inland conquest or territorial domination. Instead, it relied on the control of key maritime routes and port cities. Forts rose in Cochin, Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, forming a defensive network that anchored Portuguese influence. Naval patrols enforced taxation and trade monopolies. Local rulers were sometimes coerced into submission, other times bribed or persuaded through diplomacy. Portuguese officials introduced a cartaz system, a maritime passport that all regional ships were required to carry. Any vessel sailing without one risked being seized or destroyed. This licensing system, backed by Portugal's naval might, allowed the Portuguese to dominate Indian Ocean trade, at least for a time. But dominance did not mean harmony. The Portuguese often clashed with local customs, political systems, and religions. Their aggressive Christian proselytism, led by Catholic missionaries, provoked resistance. Misunderstandings in culture and language strained diplomacy. Efforts to monopolize trade angered Muslim merchants and powerful empires, including the rising Ottomans. Despite this, the rewards were staggering. Spices, silks, gems, and other luxuries poured into Lisbon. The crown grew rich, and Portugal's prestige in Europe soared. King Manuel I took the grand title, Lord of the Conquest. Navigation and commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. Lisbon transformed into a glittering hub of global trade, overflowing with exotic goods and foreign envoys. The Portuguese Empire had truly become worldwide, yet expansion carried heavy costs. Distant garrisons drained royal finances. Corruption and inefficiency spread among colonial administrators. Disease, harsh conditions, and warfare claimed countless Portuguese lives. And although the empire controlled certain ports and trade routes, it held little sway over the vast territories beyond them. Even so, the Estado da India remained a bold and pioneering maritime experiment, the first sustained European effort to command Indian Ocean commerce through naval power. It connected Portugal directly to India, Southeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf, setting the stage for further expansion toward East Asia. By the early 16th century, Portugal stood as the preeminent European power of the seas. With Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz under control, It now turned its gaze eastward. The next goal lay in the wealthy, mysterious lands of East Asia, China, Japan, and the Spice Islands of the Pacific. Drawn by tales of unimaginable riches, Chinese silks, Japanese silver, and the spices of the southern seas, Portuguese merchants, sailors, and missionaries ventured into new waters. Armed with knowledge from Arab and Asian traders, they used Malacca as their gateway to the Far East. Their first major objective was the Moluccas, Europe's legendary spice islands. Located in present-day Indonesia, they produced cloves, nutmeg, and mace, treasures that could make fortunes in Europe. Even before Malacca's conquest was complete, Portuguese expeditions began pushing toward the islands. By the 1520s, their ships reached the Banda Islands and Ternate. There they negotiated with local rulers, built small forts, and attempted to monopolize spice production. Though limited by distance and strong native resistance, the Portuguese maintained a tenuous influence through naval superiority and strategic alliances. Their attention then turned to China, the great empire that dominated East Asia. Unlike the independent ports of Southeast Asia, Ming China was a vast bureaucratic state that strictly regulated foreign contact. Trade was allowed only through controlled tribute missions. Nevertheless, Portuguese traders were determined to break through. In 1515, Jorge Alvarez became the first recorded European to set foot on Chinese soil, landing near present-day Hong Kong. Soon after, Simón de Andrade's fleet arrived at Tuen Mun, but their unruly conduct, violence, smuggling, and kidnapping infuriated Chinese officials. A Portuguese diplomatic mission led by Tomé Pires in 1522 ended in disaster. Several envoys were imprisoned or executed. Relations collapsed, and for decades Portugal was barred from Chinese ports. Eventually, however, more cautious diplomacy prevailed. In 1557, after years of negotiation, the Portuguese were permitted to settle in a small fishing village called Macau. Located at the mouth of the Pearl River near Canton, Macau became Portugal's official bridge to China. It was unique in the empire, acquired not through war but through agreement. The Portuguese paid rent to Chinese authorities and were allowed to build churches, warehouses, and schools. Over time, Macau grew into a thriving multicultural hub where Portuguese, Chinese, and mixed Macanese communities lived and traded together. It became the beating heart of East Asian trade, linking China, Japan, and Southeast Asia to Portugal's global network. If China was cautious, Japan was curious. In 1543, Portuguese traders landed near Tanegashima Island, marking the first European arrival in Japan. The Japanese were immediately fascinated by Portuguese firearms, which they began producing locally and called Tanegashima. These weapons soon influenced the ongoing Sengoku Wars that ravaged the country. Portuguese merchants also brought silk from China, wool from Europe, and silver from the Americas, exchanging them for Japanese silver and copper. This triangular trade between Japan, China, and Southeast Asia proved enormously profitable. Religion added another layer to these relations. In 1549, Jesuit missionary Francis Xavier arrived in Japan to spread Christianity under Portuguese royal patronage. He was received warmly by some feudal lords, especially in Kyushu, and many Japanese converted. Jesuit missions flourished for decades, adapting to local customs and languages. But as Japan unified under Toyotomi Hideyoshi and later Tokugawa Ieyasu, tolerance faded. Suspicion of foreign influence grew, Christianity was banned, and Portuguese access was restricted. Still, for a brief period, Japan had been an active participant in Portugal's vast trading web. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, Portuguese ambitions met stronger resistance. Attempts to control parts of present-day Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia failed. Trade and missionary activity persisted, but local powers remained dominant. Yet traces of Portuguese presence endured in loanwords, architecture, and art across coastal Asia. Throughout their expansion, the Portuguese relied on adaptability. They blended diplomacy, commerce, and warfare, adjusting strategies to local realities. They built alliances when possible, forts when necessary, and missions wherever faith could take root. But the empire was thinly stretched. Its global network depended more on fragile treaties than on firm control. By the mid-16th century, Portugal's empire stretched from Brazil to Japan, the first truly global empire in human history. It was bound together by the sea, by trade, and by faith. Yet beneath the grandeur, cracks had begun to form. While the Portuguese dominated the Indian Ocean and reached East Asia, a new chapter was unfolding across the Atlantic. In the west, the discovery and colonization of Brazil and the rise of the transatlantic slave trade created a second center of imperial power. This South Atlantic world would soon reshape the empire's future, driven by sugar, gold, and the forced labor that sustained it. The story of Brazil began almost by accident. In 1500, Pedro Álvares Cabral set sail for India following Vasco da Gama's route, but his fleet veered far west, carried by Atlantic winds. On April 22nd, he sighted land, the eastern coast of what is now Brazil. Cabral claimed it for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, which had divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal. Brazil fell within Portugal's sphere, giving the crown legal claim to the new land. At first, Brazil seemed less promising than Asia. It lacked the rich cities and trade systems of India or the Spice Islands. Early Portuguese presence was minimal, focused on extracting Brazilwood, a red dye tree that gave the land its name. Traders exchanged metal tools and cloth with indigenous groups for logging rights. But as the 16th century progressed, interest in Brazil grew. Its vast coastline, fertile soil, and tropical climate proved ideal for sugarcane cultivation. Sugar, already profitable on Madeira and São Tomé, would now transform Brazil into the economic heart of Portugal's Atlantic empire. By the 1530s, the Portuguese crown began consolidating its presence in Brazil. King João III introduced a system of hereditary captaincies, dividing the vast coastline into long strips of land granted to noblemen and entrepreneurs responsible for settling, defending, and developing them. The results were uneven. Many captaincies collapsed under the weight of poor planning, resistance from indigenous communities, and lack of resources. Yet a few, like Pernambuco and São Vicente, managed to thrive, largely due to the emergence of sugar plantations that transformed Brazil's economy. In 1549, the Portuguese crown took direct control, establishing a centralized colonial government and appointing Tomé de Souza as the first governor-general. He founded the city of Salvador, which became Brazil's colonial capital. From there, forts, churches, and missions began to rise, marking the start of organized colonization under royal authority. With official support, settlement expanded rapidly, and Brazil's economic significance within the empire grew. As sugar production flourished, so did the demand for labor. At first, the Portuguese turned to the indigenous peoples, enslaving them through raids, coercion, or manipulation under the guise of missionary protection. But epidemics, fierce resistance, and logistical difficulties made this unsustainable. The colonists soon looked elsewhere for a more controllable labor source, and their eyes turned to Africa. For decades, Portugal had maintained coastal trading posts along West Africa. Elmina in modern Ghana, Luanda in Angola, and others from Senegambia to the Congo River had once focused on gold and ivory. Now they became centers for the trafficking of human lives. The Portuguese didn't rule these territories directly. Instead, they relied on networks of African intermediaries, alliances with local rulers, and pre-existing trade systems. Captives were taken in regional wars or raids by African groups, then sold to Portuguese merchants in exchange for guns, textiles, and metal goods. While profitable for some African elites, the trade unleashed social collapse, endless warfare, and demographic devastation. By the late 1500s, tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were being transported across the Atlantic, to toil in Brazil's plantations, mines, and households. Their forced labor became the backbone of the colony's economy and permanently reshaped its social fabric. Yet amid this brutality, African culture endured. Languages, music, spirituality, and foodways blended with Portuguese and indigenous traditions to create Brazil's distinct cultural identity. Portuguese activity in Africa was not confined to slavery. Missionaries, especially Jesuits, expanded their influence in the Kingdom of Congo, where rulers like Nzinga Ankuru converted to Christianity in the late 1400s, taking the name João I. His successors maintained close diplomatic and religious ties with Lisbon, adopting certain European administrative practices. But such relationships were fragile, strained by cultural misunderstandings and exploitation. In regions like Angola, Portuguese ambitions to extend control inland brought conflict with African powers such as Ndongo. These tensions foreshadowed the deeper colonization that would grip Africa centuries later. Meanwhile, Brazil's coastline transformed as sugar wealth grew. Cities like Recife, Olinda, and Rio de Janeiro flourished as centers of trade, governance, and religion. The Jesuits, already active in Asia, now poured their efforts into the Americas. They built schools, churches, and missions aimed at converting indigenous populations and regulating colonial morality. Though often defenders of natives against exploitation, their mission system still sought to reshape indigenous culture into a European Christian mold. By the end of the 16th century, Brazil had eclipsed Portugal's Asian colonies in economic importance. Its sugar fed Europe's appetite, its slaves supplied endless labor, and its ports tied Africa and the Americas together in a web of imperial commerce. But such wealth drew envy. The Dutch, English, and French soon began to challenge Portuguese dominance across the Atlantic world. As the Portuguese Empire expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, it carried not just goods, guns, and galleons, but a faith. Catholicism was inseparable from the Portuguese state, shaping its worldview and serving as a tool of governance and justification. To expand empire was to spread the faith. Missionaries accompanied soldiers and merchants, infusing colonization with spiritual purpose. This drive had deep roots in Portugal's medieval past, born of the Christian Reconquista, when the monarchy and church stood united in reclaiming Iberia from Muslim rule. That unity persisted. Kings described overseas expansion as a divine mission, while papal decrees granted legitimacy to conquest. At first, religious activity in the empire was informal, chaplains offering services aboard ships or in new settlements. But soon formal missionary orders took command, none more so than the Society of Jesus, founded in 1534 by Ignatius of Loyola and sanctioned by the Pope in 1540. The Jesuits became the intellectual and missionary vanguard of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. By the mid-1500s, they had established themselves across Portugal's dominions. In India, Goa emerged as the empire's spiritual capital, home to the Jesuit College of St. Paul, a beacon of learning and conversion. Among the most celebrated Jesuits was Francis Xavier, co-founder of the order and emissary of King João III. Arriving in Goa in 1542, he traversed the empire preaching from India to the Maluku Islands and Japan. His fervor and humility drew thousands of converts and laid the foundation for enduring Christian communities. Xavier's arrival in Japan marked one of the boldest chapters of Portuguese missionary history. Within decades, entire regions embraced Christianity and several daimyo became patrons of the faith. Jesuits adapted their approach to Japanese culture, translating texts and establishing schools. But as Japan's rulers sought national unity, foreign religions grew suspect. By the early 1600s, persecution began, churches destroyed, missionaries executed or expelled, and Christianity forced into hiding where it survived in secrecy for centuries. In Africa, missionary work evolved differently. In Congo, Christianity took root among elites, blending with indigenous customs to form a unique African Christianity. Jesuits and other orders operated alongside traders and soldiers in Angola and Mozambique, yet their mission was entangled with the slave trade. Some priests condemned the cruelty, others rationalized it as a means to salvation. This moral contradiction remains one of the darkest shadows on the Church's imperial legacy. In Brazil, the Jesuits' presence was equally transformative and conflicted. They created aldeias, mission villages meant to convert and civilize indigenous peoples by separating them from colonial exploitation. Within these enclaves, they taught farming, literacy, and Catholic doctrine. Early Jesuits like Manuel de Nóbrega and José de Anchieta even opposed the enslavement of natives, though their goal was still assimilation into European Christian norms. African slaves, too, were drawn into the Church's orbit. Baptism became obligatory, and many joined Catholic brotherhoods, hermandades, that offered social unity and a means to preserve fragments of African identity. Through syncretism, Afro-Brazilian religions emerged, fusing saints with African deities. Festivals, processions, and church music reflected this deep cultural blending. Yet the Church also reinforced colonial hierarchy. It benefited from slave labor, vast land grants, and close ties to the crown. Though preaching moral virtue, it rarely challenged the social order that sustained its power. By the 17th century, religion was fully institutionalized within Portugal's imperial system. Under the Padroado Real, or royal patronage, the monarchy controlled church appointments and revenues across its territories. Bishops and priests often acted as both spiritual shepherds and royal agents. Jesuits sometimes clashed with colonial authorities, wielding near-autonomous power in remote areas where civil administration was weak. Still, the alliance between cross and crown remained firm, justifying conquest as divine duty and providing moral order to a global empire. But as the 1600s began, Portugal's power faced new tests, not from within the Church, but from without. The rise of rival European powers and a looming dynastic crisis would soon shake the empire to its core, leading to one of the most unexpected turns in Portuguese history: the Iberian Union and the empire's temporary absorption into the Spanish crown. Beneath the surface of triumph, Portugal's empire was fragile. It rested on distant trade routes, limited manpower, and rising competition from ambitious European rivals. The appearance of strength concealed deep vulnerabilities that would soon be exposed by political chaos and foreign entanglements. The crisis began in 1578 with the tragic death of King Sebastian. Young, zealous, and inspired by the crusading spirit of old, he sought to carve out Christian glory in North Africa. Leading a massive expedition into Morocco, Sebastião aimed to expand Portuguese influence and revive the medieval ideal of holy conquest. But at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, his army was annihilated. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers perished, and the king himself vanished amid the chaos, his body never found. Without an heir, Portugal was thrown into uncertainty. Sebastião's disappearance ignited both grief and confusion, and a dangerous vacuum of power emerged. His great-uncle, Cardinal Henrique, took the throne, but as an aging cleric with no successor, his rule only delayed the inevitable crisis. When Henrique died 2 years later in 1580, Portugal was left without a clear heir. Several claimants came forward, but two figures stood out. One was Antonio, Prior of Crato, an illegitimate member of the royal line who gained support from nationalists and segments of the clergy. The other was King Philip II of Spain, grandson of Portugal's Manuel I through his mother, and ruler of the vast Spanish Empire. Philip's claim combined legal legitimacy with overwhelming military might, determined to secure Portugal's throne peacefully if possible, and by force if necessary. He invaded in 1580. His forces crushed Antonio's army at the Battle of Alcantara. Soon after, the Cortes of Tomar, Portugal's assembly, recognized Philip as Philip I of Portugal in 1581. In return, Philip promised to honor Portuguese autonomy. Portugal was to remain a separate kingdom with its own laws, currency, and colonial administration. Its empire would stay under Portuguese management, and Lisbon would remain its capital. Thus began the Iberian Union, a personal union of crowns under one monarch but two distinct empires. For a time, this arrangement appeared stable. Portuguese nobles received royal favor, and Philip largely upheld the nation's privileges. But reality soon diverged from promise. Portugal, bound to Spain, became entangled in Spain's wider conflicts, especially its bitter wars with the Dutch Republic. The Dutch, newly independent from Spain, saw the Portuguese Empire as fair game, since it now fell under Spanish rule. They struck swiftly, seizing Portuguese territories across the globe. Dutch fleets captured parts of Brazil, including Pernambuco and Recife, and challenged Portuguese strongholds in Africa, taking Elmina and Luanda. In Asia, they expelled the Portuguese from Malacca and other strategic outposts. Each loss weakened the foundations of Portugal's global power. The creation of the Dutch East India Company in 1602 further accelerated the shift in dominance. Backed by immense private capital and advanced ships, the Dutch replaced Portugal as the leading maritime power in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese merchants could not compete with their rivals' efficiency and firepower. Meanwhile, within Portugal itself, resentment simmered. The Iberian Union eroded national pride. Spanish officials filled key positions once reserved for Portuguese nobles. Taxes rose, trade declined, and the sense of sovereignty withered. By the 1630s, discontent had hardened into rebellion. When Spain demanded more troops and resources to suppress uprisings in Catalonia, the Portuguese nobility refused. On December 1, 1640, conspirators in Lisbon overthrew the Spanish governor and declared independence. They crowned João, Duke of Braganza, as King João IV, founding the Braganza dynasty. The revolution was swift, nearly bloodless, and celebrated as a divine restoration of national honor. Yet independence was not secure. Spain refused to recognize Portugal's secession, launching a war to reclaim its former vassal. For nearly 3 decades, both nations clashed in the Restoration War. Despite Spain's superior resources, Portugal, supported discreetly by France and England, held firm. Its soldiers defended the homeland while colonial forces fought abroad to reclaim lost territories. In Brazil, Portuguese settlers rose against the Dutch, battling for control of sugar-rich lands. In Africa and Asia, governors struggled to restore trade routes and reassert authority. By 1668, Spain finally recognized Portugal's independence, ending decades of conflict. Though much of its empire had been damaged, Portugal had survived and preserved its sovereignty. The Iberian Union left a complex legacy. It had temporarily expanded Portugal's reach, but exposed the risks of shared monarchy. By intertwining with Spain's ambitions, Portugal had nearly lost everything it had built. The experience proved that even a global empire could be undone by the ambitions of its rulers and the rivalries of its neighbors. After 1640, the newly restored kingdom faced the monumental task of rebuilding. Its navy was weakened, its overseas territories scattered, and its rivals, especially the Dutch and the English, stronger than ever. Still, one colony offered hope. Across the Atlantic, Brazil had survived the storms of war. Its sugar fields continued to yield vast profits, sustained by enslaved African labor and global demand. In the decades that followed, Brazil would become not just a colony, but the beating heart of the Portuguese Empire. The restoration of independence marked more than political renewal. It was the beginning of a new imperial chapter. But this chapter unfolded in a world transformed by competition, capitalism, and colonization. As Portugal sought to rebuild its fortunes, its destiny would once again hinge on the Atlantic, on Brazil's wealth, Africa's labor, and the fragile balance between ambition and survival. Portuguese missionaries and traders were expelled, Japanese Christians were persecuted, and the nation entered an era of isolation. The Dutch replaced the Portuguese, permitted to trade only under strict conditions from the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki. This moment marked the definitive end of Portuguese influence in Japan. In the Americas, however, Portuguese Brazil increasingly emerged as the central pillar of the empire. The loss of Asian ports redirected Portugal's attention toward the South Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade, sugar exports, and inland expansion became the main engines of recovery. The Crown promoted settlement, supported missionary work, and tightened administrative control across its territories. By the close of the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire had transformed dramatically. It was no longer the unrivaled maritime power of the early 16th century. It had lost many of its Asian and African outposts, endured humiliation at the hands of the Dutch, and struggled to compete with the rising might of England and France. Yet it had endured. The recapture of Brazil, continued control of Angola and Mozambique, and the persistence of its cultural and religious influence across distant lands allowed Portugal to maintain a global presence. The empire had adapted, restructured, and now looked increasingly toward the Atlantic for its future. By the middle of the 17th century, Portugal had re-established its independence under the Braganza dynasty. But that independence was precarious. The Declaration of Sovereignty in 1640, led by João, Duke of Braganza, now crowned King João IV, sparked a long and dangerous conflict known as the Restoration War. This war would determine not only Portugal's future as a sovereign state, but also the destiny of its global empire during an age of upheaval and renewal. The Restoration War lasted nearly 3 decades, from 1640 to 1668. Though the decisive act had begun in Lisbon with a bloodless coup against Spanish authority, the true struggle was maintaining the kingdom's freedom against the power of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. Spain, under King Philip IV, refused to acknowledge João's legitimacy and sought to reclaim control over Portugal and its colonies. Despite this looming threat, the Portuguese people united behind their monarch. The Braganza claim was championed not only by nobles, but also by merchants, clergy, and commoners, all weary of Spanish rule. João Carta moved swiftly. He established a council of war, reorganized the army, and sought alliances abroad. Realizing Portugal could not prevail alone, he turned to Europe's balance of power for aid. The timing favored him. Spain was entangled in numerous wars, including the devastating 30 Years' War, which drained its treasury and divided its focus. France, eager to weaken its longtime rival, extended diplomatic and financial support to Portugal. England, though initially cautious, later sealed a formal alliance through the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to King Charles II in 1662, a union that gave Portugal a crucial ally. The conflict itself consisted of raids, skirmishes, and major battles along the Iberian frontier. Though often outnumbered, Portuguese troops relied on strategic defense, knowledge of the terrain, and guerrilla tactics to repel invasions. One of their most decisive victories came at Monte Claros in 1665, where Portuguese forces defeated a larger Spanish army. That triumph boosted national morale and convinced foreign powers that the Braganza dynasty was secure. While battles raged in Europe, the Braganza government worked to strengthen control over the empire overseas. This required diplomatic recognition and at times direct military intervention. In Brazil, the Portuguese had already expelled the Dutch but still needed to consolidate power. Colonial officials reinforced fortifications, expanded settlements, and improved ports to support trade and immigration. Brazil, with its vast lands and lucrative sugar plantations, was now the undeniable heart of the empire. Elsewhere, recovery proved uneven. Some territories lost under Spanish rule were never regained. The Dutch held parts of the Spice Islands and disrupted Portuguese commerce in Asia. In Africa, several forts had fallen, and efforts to restore old trade routes were met with limited success. Yet the empire endured, maintaining its sovereignty in key strongholds like Angola, Mozambique, and Macau. One of the greatest challenges for the Braganza monarchy was administrative reform. The 17th century had exposed how fragile and overstretched Portugal's imperial system truly was. Communication between Lisbon and its colonies could take months, and corruption among officials was rampant. Inefficient tax collection and bureaucratic disorder undermined the crown's authority. In response, the government centralized control. Viceroys and governors were granted clearer mandates, and oversight councils were established to ensure accountability. The Casa de India, once the engine of Portugal's global trade, was restructured to improve coordination of naval defense, economic policy, and colonial law. Lisbon also expanded royal monopolies and trade charters to stabilize revenue and curb smuggling. Religious orders remained deeply involved in imperial affairs. The Jesuits continued to dominate education and missionary activity, mediating between settlers and indigenous communities. Yet their power increasingly came under scrutiny. The crown sought to ensure that religious influence served royal interests, not independent ambition. Cultural and intellectual life in Portugal also reflected this national renewal. Writers, artists, and theologians celebrated the Braganza Restoration as both a divine victory and a rebirth of Portuguese identity. Poems, chronicles, and paintings glorified the courage of soldiers and the sanctity of faith. The Restoration was not just political, it was spiritual, a reaffirmation of destiny. Finally, in 1668, peace was secured. The Treaty of Lisbon formally recognized João IV's descendants as Portugal's legitimate rulers and ended the Restoration War. Spain, exhausted and overextended, could no longer sustain its resistance. With sovereignty restored, Portugal could at last turn to rebuilding its empire. The end of the war marked a new era of recovery, reform, and adaptation. The world had changed profoundly. The Dutch and English now dominated global trade, while France expanded its own colonial reach. Portugal faced a new reality. Survival depended on innovation and resilience, yet survival itself was an extraordinary feat. Against immense odds, Portugal had reclaimed its independence and preserved its empire's core. Brazil remained Portuguese, the African slave trade continued to supply its colonies, and fragments of influence in Asia still endured. With the Restoration War concluded and independence confirmed, Portugal entered a fresh imperial phase. No longer the unmatched seafaring empire of old, it now focused its energy on its greatest possession, Brazil. Over the next century, Brazil would evolve from a peripheral plantation economy into the economic, demographic, and administrative center of Portuguese power. At the heart of this transformation were two forces, sugar and gold. Sugar had been Brazil's economic backbone since the 16th century. Developed first on the Atlantic islands and later expanded across northeastern Brazil, the plantation system relied on enslaved African labor. By the late 17th century, regions such as Pernambuco and Bahia were key hubs of the global sugar trade, but profits began to decline. Competition from Dutch and French Caribbean colonies flooded the market with cheaper sugar. To survive, Portuguese Brazil needed a new source of wealth, and it came from deep beneath the earth. In the late 1680s and early 1690s, bands of explorers known as bandeirantes pushed into Brazil's interior, beyond official colonial boundaries. Originally slave hunters, they shifted focus when they discovered gold in the mountainous region of Minas Gerais, literally the general mines. The ensuing gold rush transformed Brazil. By the early 18th century, Minas Gerais had become the most dynamic region in the colony. Thousands migrated from Portugal and the coasts to the interior in search of fortune. New towns sprang up overnight, most famously Vila Rica, now Ouro Preto, the glittering heart of gold production. The influx of wealth and people reshaped the landscape. Roads were carved through forests and mountains to connect the mines with the ports of Rio de Janeiro and Salvador. Trade, agriculture, and commerce flourished along these routes. The crown imposed strict controls. All gold had to pass through official smelters, where a royal fifth, the quinto, was collected as tax. Smuggling became widespread, with gold hidden in barrels or melted into household items. The authorities responded with harsh crackdowns, confiscations, and imprisonment. Despite this, the wealth pouring from Brazil was staggering. During its peak decades, Brazil produced more gold than any other region on Earth, and Lisbon's economy came to depend on it. Socially, the gold boom brought upheaval. Mining towns were turbulent, diverse, and often lawless. They attracted settlers, enslaved Africans, freedmen, artisans, and traders from across the empire. Rigid hierarchies were challenged as fortune and enterprise reshaped colonial society. The demand for labor surged, leading to a massive influx of enslaved Africans who endured grueling conditions underground and in mining camps. Some escaped and formed quilombos, runaway slave communities, far from colonial control. The most famous of these was Palmares, which grew into a powerful autonomous settlement before being destroyed by Portuguese troops in the late 17th century. Its legacy, however, endured as a symbol of resistance and freedom. Administratively, the crown tightened its grip on Brazil. In 1763, the capital was moved from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro, reflecting the southward shift in power and commerce. Rio became the hub of gold exports, the center of administration, and Portugal's vital link to its Atlantic empire. Through reform and exploitation, Portugal reshaped its empire once more, smaller, leaner, but still alive, driven now by the riches and rhythms of the New World. A more refined class of administrators, tax officials and military officers was dispatched from Europe to enforce royal authority across the empire. The ouvidores, royal judges, and capitães mors, or military commanders, were responsible for implementing the crown's policies and maintaining order in the colonies. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church retained enormous influence. Jesuit missionaries continued their work, while dioceses and clergy oversaw both the spiritual and educational life of colonial Brazil. Education during this period remained primarily religious. Jesuit colleges in major towns taught Latin, rhetoric, and Christian doctrine, focusing largely on the sons of elite families. Opportunities for higher learning were scarce, and most Brazilians, especially women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans, had little or no access to formal education. Yet despite these restrictions, cultural expression thrived. The riches from gold and diamond mining funded an outpouring of artistic and architectural creativity. Baroque art flourished, and grand religious festivals became the pulse of colonial society. In cities such as Ouro Preto and Mariana, ornate churches rose from local stone, blending European Baroque grandeur with African and indigenous craftsmanship. The sculptor Alejandro, active during the late 18th century, became the most iconic figure of this hybrid style, a living testament to the merging of cultures under colonial rule. Intellectual life also began to evolve. Although strict censorship and ecclesiastical control remained in place, Enlightenment ideas started to seep into Brazil through imported books, letters, and travelers returning from Europe. Members of the colonial elite quietly debated new concepts about governance, human rights, and economic freedom. They began to question the rigid hierarchy of monarchy, slavery, and foreign domination. These early sparks of dissent would eventually kindle into movements for change in the coming centuries. Portugal's reliance on Brazilian gold was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed the crown to pay off debts, fund wars in Europe, and rebuild public infrastructure. Indeed, Lisbon's reconstruction after the catastrophic earthquake of 1755 was largely financed with wealth from the mines of Minas Gerais. But as easily accessible gold deposits dwindled later in the 18th century, Portugal's economy faltered. This dependence left the empire fragile and overextended. The tightening of economic control and taxation policies deepened resentment among Brazil's regional elites. Conflicts over trade restrictions and royal appointments intensified, fueling a growing sense that the relationship between colony and crown was exploitative. The groundwork for future resistance was quietly being laid. By the mid-18th century, Brazil had become the beating heart of the Portuguese Empire. Its economy, population, and cultural vitality surpassed those of Portugal's Asian possessions, making it indispensable to imperial survival. Lisbon's fortunes now rose and fell with Brazil's prosperity. Yet, beneath this prosperity lay deep inefficiencies and corruption. It was during this period of contradiction, of wealth and weakness, that Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquis of Pombal, rose to prominence. Born to a minor noble family in the early 18th century, Carvalho e Melo advanced through diplomacy and administration by sheer intelligence, pragmatism, and political mastery. His fortunes changed dramatically when King José Bertha ascended the throne in 1750 and made him his closest advisor. Within a few short years, Pombal became Portugal's de facto prime minister, wielding immense power over both domestic and colonial policy. The defining event of his career came in 1755, when a devastating earthquake struck Lisbon on All Saints' Day. A massive tremor, followed by tsunamis and fires, annihilated much of the city and killed tens of thousands. The king withdrew from public life, leaving Pombal to take command. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he declared, words that defined his decisive, pragmatic leadership. He mobilized the army, maintained order, and orchestrated one of the earliest examples of modern urban planning. Lisbon was rebuilt on a rational geometric grid with broad boulevards, earthquake-resistant buildings, and administrative centers reflecting Enlightenment ideals of symmetry and reason. But for Pombal, reconstruction was only the beginning. He saw the catastrophe as an opportunity to reinvent the entire empire. He sought to strengthen royal power, weaken the aristocracy and clergy, and modernize both Portugal and its colonies. In 1759, he ordered the expulsion of the Jesuits from all Portuguese territories. Once the backbone of education and missionary work, the Jesuits were accused of political intrigue and economic manipulation. Their schools were closed, their properties confiscated, and their missions dismantled. In Brazil, this upheaval had lasting consequences. The Jesuit missions that had protected indigenous communities from enslavement were dissolved, exposing native populations to exploitation under new, secular, and colonial authorities. Pombal's reforms extended into every corner of governance. He restructured colonial administration, increased taxation, cracked down on smuggling, and demanded tighter economic oversight. Education was transformed into a tool of the state. Secular schools replaced religious ones, curricula were standardized, and sciences and practical studies were encouraged. He envisioned a new generation of loyal bureaucrats, educated, rational, and committed to royal authority. Economically, he worked to diversify production and assert state control over commerce. Royal trading companies were established, manufacturing was promoted, and Brazil's economy was encouraged to expand beyond gold and sugar into tobacco, cotton, and cattle ranching. Though often met with fierce resistance, these policies marked Portugal's first serious attempt at modernization. Yet Pombal ruled with an iron hand. His enemies, aristocrats, clergy, and colonial elites, suffered exile, imprisonment, or worse. After an attempted assassination of King José in 1758, known as the Tavora Affair, Pombal used the event to crush his opponents. The powerful Tavora family was executed, their estates seized, and dissent silenced through fear. Despite his authoritarianism, his influence was undeniable. Under Pombal's vision, Lisbon emerged from ruin as a beacon of Enlightenment architecture and order. Brazil too became more tightly integrated into the empire with new institutions, regulations, and infrastructure. Mining continued, albeit with stricter oversight, and frontier regions opened to exploration and trade. However, his suppression of the Jesuits and heavy taxation bred long-term discontent among colonial elites. Pombal also sought to populate and secure the Amazon, establishing settlements and administrative posts to assert Portuguese control against Spanish encroachment. Although geography and isolation limited his success, the initiative symbolized his ambition to make Portugal a modern, globally competitive empire. When King José died in 1777, Queen Maria I had immediately dismissed Pombal, reversing several of his harshest measures. Nonetheless, his reforms endured in Portugal's institutions, education, and economy. He had redefined governance in the Age of Enlightenment, centralized, rational, but deeply authoritarian. Yet his policies had also sown the seeds of future upheaval. The burden of taxation, suppression of privilege, and expanding colonial bureaucracy fueled calls for greater autonomy. In Brazil, regional identities hardened, and revolutionary ideas about liberty and self-rule began to take root. The Marquis of Pombal remains one of the most polarizing figures in Portuguese history, hailed as a visionary reformer by some and condemned as a ruthless despot by others. But his legacy reshaped the empire at a moment of profound transition, steering it toward modernity while tightening the chains that would soon be broken. As the 18th century drew to a close, new storms gathered over Europe. The Napoleonic Wars erupted, shaking monarchies and empires to their core. For Portugal, these conflicts would trigger one of the most extraordinary events in colonial history: the relocation of the royal court to Brazil. Facing Napoleon's invasion and bound by an ancient alliance with Britain, the Portuguese crown fled across the Atlantic in 1807. Escorted by the British Navy, the royal family and thousands of courtiers embarked on a perilous voyage that would forever change the destiny of their colony. When the fleet arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, Brazil ceased to be merely a colony. For the first time, a European monarchy ruled from the Americas, turning the once subordinate land into the living heart of the Portuguese Empire. What began as an act of desperation became the spark of transformation, a new chapter in the long and complex story of Brazil's rise from colony to kingdom. Brazil, once considered a distant colonial outpost, had now become the center of a global empire. Royal institutions once rooted in Lisbon were rebuilt across the Atlantic, transforming Rio de Janeiro into the new imperial capital. The royal palace, ministries, treasury, and foreign embassies were re-established in the heart of the city, bringing with them a wave of prestige and power. Nobles, bureaucrats, and merchants flocked to Rio, eager to be near the royal court that now governed from the tropics. For the first time, the Portuguese Empire was being administered not from Europe, but from the Americas. This relocation fundamentally changed the empire's economic structure. In 1808, Prince João issued a decree opening Brazilian ports to international trade, effectively dismantling the old colonial monopoly that had long bound Brazil exclusively to Portugal. The decree marked the end of 3 centuries of mercantilist restriction. British merchants, taking full advantage of the new policy, flooded into Brazilian markets. They established banks, warehouses, and trading houses, integrating Brazil rapidly into the networks of global commerce and early industrial capitalism. The result was a new era of prosperity, innovation, and foreign influence. The transformation also extended to infrastructure. The influx of wealth and royal administration spurred the construction of roads, ports, and docks. Printing presses began to operate, facilitating the spread of newspapers and books for the first time in colonial history. Rio de Janeiro, once a sleepy port overshadowed by Lisbon, became a cosmopolitan capital alive with political debate, intellectual activity, and artistic expression. The arrival of the court brought aristocrats, scholars, soldiers, and foreign diplomats, changing the very character of the city. New libraries, opera houses, botanical gardens, and academies emerged. In 1810, the Royal Library opened to the public, soon followed by the founding of a medical school and institutions of higher learning. These developments turned Rio into the cultural and intellectual center of the Portuguese-speaking world. Yet, beneath the surface of royal splendor lay deep contradictions. While Enlightenment ideals and European refinement shaped the life of the court, slavery remained the foundation of Brazil's economy. Enslaved Africans and their descendants worked in homes, fields, and urban construction, sustaining the luxury that surrounded the monarchy. The glittering palaces and theatres of Rio stood in stark contrast to the brutal realities of forced labour and racial inequality that defined everyday life. For Portugal itself, the consequences of the royal relocation were complex. The monarchy's absence left the European homeland vulnerable. In 1808, British forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal to resist the Napoleonic invasion. The Peninsular War that followed raged for years, devastating parts of the Iberian Peninsula. But, with British support, Portuguese forces eventually expelled the French and preserved national sovereignty. By 1813, the war had ended in victory, but the social and political order in Portugal had been profoundly shaken. During the monarchy's exile, new political movements began to emerge in Lisbon. Inspired by liberal ideas spreading across post-Napoleonic Europe, reformers called for constitutional limits on royal power and a representative government. These demands would soon clash with the interests of the royal court in Brazil. Meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazilian elites grew accustomed to direct access to the crown. They had enjoyed unprecedented economic freedom, wealth, and influence under the new arrangement. For them, the old colonial relationship with Lisbon no longer seemed acceptable. Many began to see Brazil not as a colony, but as an equal partner in empire. In 1815, responding to these shifting dynamics, Prince João elevated Brazil to the rank of a co-equal kingdom within the new United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This formalized Brazil's equality within the empire, at least on paper, and symbolized its transformation from dependency to partnership. But the new status raised an inevitable question. If Brazil was a kingdom, why should it not govern itself? That question gained urgency when King João VI returned to Portugal in 1821. Pressed by the liberal revolution in Lisbon and mounting unrest in Europe, the king departed Brazil, leaving his son Dom Pedro as regent. His return was meant to restore order, but it instead set in motion the chain of events that would dissolve the empire's unity. For 13 years, Brazil had governed itself under royal supervision, developing its own institutions, bureaucracy, and political identity. Now, with the monarch gone, many Brazilians feared a reassertion of colonial control. The crisis came to a head when the Portuguese Cortes, the new constitutional assembly formed after the 1820 revolution, sought to reverse Brazil's autonomy. The Cortes demanded the return of the royal family, the subordination of Brazil to Lisbon's authority, and the restoration of old mercantile restrictions. To Brazilian elites, these measures represented not reform, but regression, a direct threat to the political and economic freedoms gained since 1808. Caught between the two sides, Dom Pedro faced a fateful decision. The Cortes ordered him to return to Portugal and dissolve the Brazilian regency, while Brazilian leaders urged him to stay. After months of tension, on January 9, 1822, he made his choice. "I shall remain," he declared, an event remembered as the Dia do Fico, or I will stay, day. That decision marked the beginning of Brazil's independence movement. In the months that followed, Dom Pedro removed Portuguese officials from key positions, convened a Brazilian assembly, and reorganized the army. Tensions between Rio and Lisbon escalated rapidly. Then on September 7, 1822, while traveling through São Paulo province, Dom Pedro received fresh orders from Lisbon commanding his immediate return and obedience to the Cortes. Instead, he drew his sword and shouted the words that would define Brazilian nationhood: Independencia ou morte, independence or death. That same day, Brazil formally declared its independence from Portugal. In December 1822, Dom Pedro was crowned Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, establishing a constitutional monarchy that preserved many of the administrative structures created under the Portuguese crown, but under a new national flag. The transition, however, was not peaceful everywhere. In the northern and northeastern provinces, Portuguese loyalist forces resisted the new regime. Battles erupted in Bahia, Maranhão, and Pará, requiring months of military campaigns before independence was fully secured. By late 1823, most of Brazil was unified under the imperial banner. Portugal, weakened and facing domestic instability, could not mount a serious counterattack. Finally, in 1825, under British mediation, Portugal formally recognized Brazil's independence in exchange for financial compensation and diplomatic guarantees. The separation marked the end of more than 3 centuries of Portuguese rule in the Americas. Brazil, the jewel of the empire, had been its richest and most populous colony, the foundation of Portugal's Atlantic wealth. Its loss shattered the imperial system built on sugar, gold, and slavery. Without Brazil, Portugal's remaining colonies in Africa and Asia became the focus of renewed attention, but none could match its former glory. The independence of Brazil was part of a broader global transformation. Across the Atlantic world, Enlightenment ideals, liberal revolutions, and nationalist movements were reshaping old empires. For Portugal, the event forced a reckoning with the limits of colonial domination and the challenges of modernization. For Brazil, independence brought continuity as much as change. Slavery endured and power remained concentrated among landowning elites. Yet, a new identity began to take form, a unified empire under a Brazilian monarch bound by language, territory, and shared ambition. Portugal's loss was profound, but it did not signal the end of its imperial dreams. Deprived of Brazil's wealth, Lisbon turned its gaze once again toward Africa. Its ancient footholds in Angola and Mozambique, long peripheral, would become central to a new imperial vision. There, in the late 19th century, Portugal would attempt to rebuild its prestige amid the fierce rivalries of the scramble for Africa. Though its reach had diminished, the spirit of empire persisted, reshaped by necessity, but still driven by the same desire for relevance, expansion, and survival that had begun centuries earlier on the shores of the Atlantic. The diplomatic humiliation at the hands of Britain ignited outrage throughout Portugal and plunged the nation into political turmoil. Nationalists accused the monarchy of weakness and incompetence, while Republican movements gained strength across the country. The dream of a trans-African Portuguese empire linking Angola to Mozambique was abandoned, but the episode revealed just how deeply Portugal's sense of identity had become tied to its imperial ambitions, even as its power and resources waned. In the aftermath of the British ultimatum, Portugal sought to strengthen its hold over the territories it still controlled. This marked the beginning of a new, more structured phase of colonial rule in Angola and Mozambique. What had once been a network of isolated trade posts and missionary settlements now evolved into formal administrative centers. The Portuguese began constructing roads, telegraph lines, and railways, though progress lagged far behind that of other European powers. A modest wave of European settlers arrived, lured by opportunities in agriculture and trade, but their numbers remained relatively small. To solidify authority, Portugal relied increasingly on military campaigns. In the interior regions, resistance was fierce. In Angola, groups such as the Ovimbundu and the Congo kingdoms resisted Portuguese encroachment, while in Mozambique, the Gaza Empire under Gungunhana waged determined opposition. Portugal responded with overwhelming violence, deploying European officers, African auxiliaries, and local allies to crush dissent. By the early 20th century, Lisbon had imposed nominal control over most of Angola and Mozambique, yet true power remained fragmented. Many regions were governed indirectly through powerful private concession companies like the Companhia de Moçambique and Companhia do Niassa. These entities were granted sweeping authority to tax, expropriate land, and enforce labor so long as they turned profits for the empire. The human toll of this system was catastrophic. African communities were subjected to forced labor, minimal pay, and harsh discipline under conditions that amounted to slavery in all but name. The practice of chibalo, compulsory labor for public works or plantations, became widespread. Men were taken from their villages for months at a time, forced to work under brutal conditions, while women and children endured famine, dislocation, and social collapse. Lisbon justified this exploitation under the banner of civilization and Christian progress. The empire claimed to bring modernity, the Portuguese language, and faith to Africa. Mission schools and churches multiplied, but education remained rudimentary and selective. Only a tiny elite gained literacy, and instruction focused more on obedience than empowerment. The colonial system's true aim was extraction and control, not enlightenment. At home, the monarchy used imperial exploits to mask domestic decay. Colonial victories and supposed civilizing achievements were celebrated in schoolbooks, monuments, and public festivals. The empire was portrayed as Portugal's greatest source of pride, a symbol of national renewal amid decline. But the illusion could not last. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought deepening political crisis, labor unrest, and growing republican sentiment. The monarchy's corruption and failures eroded what little legitimacy it had left. In 1910, a peaceful revolution ended centuries of royal rule, and Portugal was declared a republic. The First Republic inherited the empire and promised reform, modernization, and justice. Colonial officials were reshuffled, and royal insignia were replaced with republican symbols. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the old structure of racial inequality and exploitation endured. The new government lacked stability, overthrown again and again by coups and factional struggles, and could not meaningfully transform its colonies. Administration fell into the hands of local governors, companies, and missionaries who ruled with near total autonomy. The African majority remained disenfranchised, overtaxed, and excluded from citizenship. A rigid racial hierarchy defined colonial life. Whites and Portuguese officials sat at the top. Mixed-race populations occupied uncertain middle positions, and Africans, classified under the system of indiginato, were denied civil rights and placed under separate, restrictive laws. Education was limited to mission schools that prioritized religion, discipline, and manual labor. Few Africans advanced beyond basic literacy, and those who did were steered into low-ranking clerical or service jobs meant to reinforce dependence rather than empowerment. Economically, the colonies were shaped entirely by European demand. Angola exported coffee, cotton, and diamonds. Mozambique grew sugar, tea, and cashews and served as a labor reservoir for neighboring British territories. Guinea-Bissau supplied peanuts and timber. These economies were built for Lisbon's benefit, not local development. Forced labor persisted, renamed as taxation or public service, but unchanged in essence. Entire communities were uprooted, families separated, and generations subjected to violence. Resistance emerged in various forms: flight, sabotage, rebellion, and the quiet endurance of traditional culture. African churches, led by local pastors, became hubs of identity and resistance. In emerging towns, wage labor created a nascent African working class, exposed to new ideas of equality and freedom spreading from abroad. When the First World War erupted, the empire's vulnerabilities became clear. Portugal entered the conflict in 1916 on the Allied side, sending troops to Europe and Africa. In Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese forces clashed with German colonial armies, relying heavily on African conscripts and porters who endured most of the suffering. The war disrupted trade and agriculture, while awakening awareness of the wider world. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles confirmed Portugal's claims in Africa, but global attitudes were shifting. The League of Nations introduced the idea of self-determination, challenging the moral basis of empire. Lisbon insisted its mission was one of civilization, not conquest, but the world was no longer convinced. In the interwar years, African intellectuals began to organize. Writers and teachers in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau formed cultural associations and published newspapers inspired by Pan-Africanism and anti-colonial movements elsewhere. Though repressed, these ideas quietly spread. The Second World War accelerated change. Portugal stayed neutral, but the conflict strained its empire. After 1945, the age of decolonization began. India gained independence, followed by a wave of liberation across Asia and Africa. But Portugal refused to yield. Under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, who had seized power in the 1930s, the regime clung to its imperial vision. It rebranded colonies as overseas provinces, declaring them inseparable from Portugal itself. This semantic trick fooled no one. Beneath the language of unity lay a system of racism, forced labor, and repression. Salazar's Estado Novo dictatorship enforced strict censorship and outlawed dissent. Any call for African rights or autonomy was branded subversion or communism. Activists were imprisoned, exiled, or silenced. By mid-century, Portugal stood isolated, an anachronistic empire in a world that had moved on. While Britain and France negotiated independence for their colonies, Portugal doubled down on its outdated dream of eternal empire. The result was inevitable. As nationalist movements gained strength in Africa, Portugal's refusal to reform ignited brutal wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. These conflicts, beginning in the early 1960s, would last over a decade, draining the empire's resources and eroding the regime that sustained it. What began as a stubborn defense of imperial pride would end in blood, revolution, and the final collapse of one of Europe's oldest colonial empires. By the late 1950s, the illusion of Portugal's unshakable empire was collapsing under growing pressure. Across Africa, nationalist movements surged forward with unstoppable momentum. Educated elites, labor organizers, veterans, and intellectuals united to form political parties and liberation fronts, demanding independence and self-determination. Their ideals were shaped by Pan-Africanism, Marxist theory, and the successful examples of decolonization in Ghana, India, and Indonesia. In Portuguese Africa, three major liberation movements rose to prominence. In Angola and Mozambique, rival groups vied for influence, but the most organized was the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, or Frelimo, led by figures such as Eduardo Mondlane and later Samora Machel. In Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, the Partido Africano da Independência da Guiné e Cabo Verde, PIGC, under the leadership of Amilcar Cabral, launched a remarkably coordinated struggle for freedom. Though differing in ideology and strategy, these movements shared a single, relentless enemy: the unyielding Portuguese colonial state. Initial demands for basic civil rights and limited autonomy were met with censorship, imprisonment, and brutal repression. When peaceful change proved impossible, the movements turned to armed resistance, aided by the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and newly independent African states. The wars officially erupted in 1961, beginning with an uprising in northern Angola. The revolt led to the deaths of hundreds of Portuguese settlers and thousands of Africans in the violent backlash that followed. That same year, Portugal suffered another humiliation when India seized Goa, Daman, and Diu, its last colonial enclaves in Asia. By 1962, full-scale insurgencies had spread to Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, marking the beginning of what Portugal called the Guerra do Ultramar, the Overseas War. In Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau, Portuguese troops faced relentless guerrilla tactics, ambushes and sabotage in vast and unforgiving terrain. Despite its small size and limited resources, Portugal sent hundreds of thousands of conscripted soldiers to fight in Africa. The cost was catastrophic. The wars consumed over half of Portugal's national budget, crippled its economy, and left the nation diplomatically isolated. The United Nations condemned Portugal's refusal to decolonize, while international sanctions further deepened its crisis. Inside Portugal, the regime ruled with iron discipline, silencing dissent and outlawing opposition. Yet discontent simmered. The long, unwinnable wars, coupled with mandatory military service, bred resentment among the youth. Thousands fled abroad to avoid conscription. Student protests, underground movements, and even members of the clergy began to question the morality and futility of the conflict. Meanwhile, the colonies bore the heaviest suffering. Entire regions were turned into war zones. Villages were destroyed or forcibly relocated. Infrastructure existed mainly to serve the military and the extractive industries that fueled Lisbon's control. Still, the liberation movements gained ground and legitimacy. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIGC established liberated zones, areas where schools, clinics, and local administrations flourished, winning global recognition for their effectiveness. As Antonio de Oliveira Salazar's health declined in the late 1960s, Marcelo Caetano took power, promising modest reforms but maintaining the same colonial policies. By the early 1970s, the wars had become Portugal's central political crisis, an endless, draining struggle that neither victory nor reform could resolve. Then, from within the military itself, came an unexpected turning point. A new generation of younger officers, many hardened by years in Africa, grew disillusioned with the regime's rigidity and the futility of war. They secretly formed the Movimento das Forças Armadas, MFA, or Armed Forces Movement. On April 25, 1974, the MFA launched a peaceful coup in Lisbon, known as the Carnation Revolution. Civilians poured into the streets, placing red carnations in the barrels of soldiers' rifles. Within hours, the authoritarian Estado Novo regime collapsed, and Caetano was overthrown. The revolution sought not only to restore democracy and freedom, but also to end the colonial wars once and for all. The new transitional government began immediate negotiations with the African liberation movements. In rapid succession, Portugal recognized the independence of Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, and Cape Verde, followed soon after by São Tomé and Príncipe. For Portugal, the sudden disintegration of its centuries-old empire was both freeing and devastating. Hundreds of thousands of settlers, soldiers, and mixed-race families, known as retornados, fled to Portugal, overwhelming housing and social services. The country entered a turbulent transition toward democracy, but liberation from empire also brought modernization and a new European identity. For the newly independent African nations, the challenges were immense. Colonial neglect had left their infrastructures weak and their economies dependent. In Angola and Mozambique, competing liberation movements turned on one another, plunging both nations into decades of civil war. Elsewhere, instability, coups, and poverty plagued the new governments. Still, the fall of the Portuguese Empire marked the end of one of the world's oldest imperial systems, a collapse born of war, resistance, and revolution. The Carnation Revolution not only ended nearly 50 years of dictatorship, but also triggered the final dismantling of Portugal's empire. Within months, centuries of overseas rule unraveled. The MFA-led government, supported by civil society and emerging political parties, prioritized peace and democracy over imperial ambition. In Guinea-Bissau, Portugal granted formal recognition to independence almost immediately. Mozambique, under the Marxist-oriented Frelimo, became independent in June 1975. Angola followed in November, though independence was swiftly marred by a brutal civil war driven by Cold War rivalries. Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe also gained freedom that same transformative year. The process was fast and chaotic. Portugal had made no real plans for transition. Colonial officials and settlers withdrew abruptly, leaving administrative vacuums. Within months, 500,000 retornados returned home, often destitute and traumatized. Their sudden arrival strained housing, jobs, and social systems, yet many brought valuable skills and new perspectives that helped modernize Portugal's economy and culture. In the former colonies, sovereignty brought both hope and hardship. Political institutions were fragile, and divisions among liberation groups deepened into long, bloody conflicts. Meanwhile, Portugal turned inward, rebuilding its democracy, reviving its economy, and redefining its place in the world. The democratic constitution of 1976 enshrined civil liberties and permanently rejected the colonial mindset. Portugal's accession to the European Economic Community in 1986 symbolized its full transformation from empire to European democracy. Yet echoes of empire remained. Two territories, East Timor and Macau, still lay under Portuguese administration. In East Timor, a tragedy unfolded. After declaring independence in 1975, the territory was invaded and occupied by Indonesia. Portugal never accepted this annexation and continued to advocate for Timorese self-determination at the United Nations. After decades of struggle, East Timor finally achieved full independence in the early 21st century, with Portugal playing a key diplomatic role. The last chapter of the empire closed in Macau. Unlike the wars elsewhere, its transition was peaceful and meticulously negotiated. Portugal had governed the enclave since the mid-16th century, blending Chinese heritage and Portuguese culture into a unique fusion. In 1987, Portugal and China signed the joint declaration, agreeing that Macau would return to Chinese sovereignty under the one country, two systems framework. On December 20, 1999, the handover was completed. The Portuguese flag was lowered, the Chinese flag raised, and one of the world's longest-running empires came to a quiet end. Portugal's imperial journey had begun almost 6 centuries earlier with the conquest of Ceuta and the voyages of Prince Henry the Navigator. Its legacy spanned continents, from the sugar plantations of Brazil to the forts of Angola, the trading posts of India, and the missions of Japan. It shaped global trade, spread languages and religions, and left behind both progress and pain. Today, Portugal has rebuilt its relationships with former colonies through diplomacy, cultural exchange, and the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, founded in 1996. Member states: Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, Brazil, East Timor, and Portugal now collaborate as partners, not subjects. Within Portugal, the empire's memory remains complex. Statues of explorers still stand in Lisbon and Porto, while museums reevaluate the imperial past through modern lenses of race, identity, and migration. Descendants of African, Asian, and Brazilian heritage now enrich Portugal's culture, blending histories once divided by empire. The Portuguese Empire may not have been the largest, but it was the longest lived. Its influence echoes across oceans in language, faith, and tradition. As Portugal entered the 21st century, it did so not as a ruler of territories, but as a nation reconciled with its history, seeking understanding, unity, and cooperation with those once under its flag. The age of empire had ended, but its threads still weave through the lives, cultures, and destinies of millions around the world.